Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Scott Appleby. I am the Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs, and I'm delighted to welcome you, both those of you here in the room and those of you on Zoom virtually with us, to this lecture by William Hederman. This particular presentation is part of our Notre Dame Forum, and our Notre Dame Forum speaker in this instance is Bill Hederman. Bill Hederman has seen it all. His career on the front lines of setting policy and debating policy on issues of energy, environment, technology spans 4 decades, starting with the Carter administration's energy policies and the Arab oil embargoes of the 1970s. Those of us who were not only born by the 1970s, but had come of the age of reason will remember the long gas lines, the president wearing a sweater as he gave what came to be known as the malaise speech in order to encourage Americans to turn their heat down and conserve energy. That didn't quite work. Hederman graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering from the University of Notre Dame, earned a master's degree in public policy from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Master of Science degree from MIT. In 2002, from 2002 to 2005, he led the establishment of the Office of Market Oversight and Investigations at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, the acronym. Responding at that moment, Bill was called in to help the agency respond to the Enron and California electricity crisis, which we'll hear more about. A statement by Bill at the time was noted across government. From now on, he announced, there will be no more overlooking at FERC, just overseeing. That is, overlooking violations of regulatory policy, managing energy questions. So Bill came in to kind of restore a little bit of regulation, law and order for companies that were not observing the energy regulatory policies. His team was largely credited for restoring public, congressional, and investor confidence in the integrity of energy markets at that time. Among Bill Hederman's most important professional accomplishment as the first energy and science budget analyst for the U.S. Congressional Budget Office was helping to establish the methodology for estimating the cost of legislation for the critical scorekeeping function of energy use. One of his interventions literally saved taxpayers billions of dollars because there was a dispute during the Carter years about whether one way to resolve some of the energy crisis was by investing heavily, almost $100 billion, in synthetic fuels, which Bill and his colleagues knew just would not work and would be a waste of money, as it later proved to be. So while there were some experiments in synthetic fuels, this major spending legislation didn't go through because it just simply didn't work. He can say more about that if he wishes. More recently, at the U.S. Department of Energy, Bill Hederman was the chief architect of the analytic approach for the Quadrennial Energy Review. He served as a lead analyst in country during that time in Ukraine for the Ukrainian President Poroshenko's and the Department of Energy to send an elite team of advisors that he could trust in building a post-invasion, post-Russian invasion energy strategy in Ukraine. Following the advice provided by the Department of Energy team, Ukraine swiftly moved from complete dependence on Russian natural gas before the invasion to zero purchases of Russian natural gas in less than 2 years. Bill teaches courses in Washington, D.C. for the Center for Strategic International Studies in partnership with Syracuse University's Maxwell School. He has served as an energy researcher and become a nationally prominent energy analyst, and emerged as an international leading executive for government, NGOs, and the private sector. So a program note, in addition to today's presentation entitled Roadmap for a Green Energy Future, Bill will deliver a lecture on these topics tomorrow at 11 a.m. in this room. I believe that's right, in this room, titled The Geopolitics of Climate Change, Visions and Policies for a Sustainable Future. All are welcome. Then on Wednesday at the noon hour, Bill will lead a 1-hour seminar discussion for up to 20 participants interested in going deeper into the topics raised in these lectures. We do have some slots open if you are interested in participating in this seminar, especially I say that to students, but all are welcome, faculty and staff and students. You can simply send an email to me, r.appleby@indy.edu, or to Cindy Swanger. Reach out and indicate you'd like to attend that seminar at noon on Wednesday. So please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, William Hederman.
Thank you, Scott. As much as I like hearing what I was doing again, I'm watching the clock. To cover what Scott asked me to cover is normally a 3-credit semester course. So I'm going to talk a little fast, and I'm going to move through things not at the 30,000 foot level, but at the International Space Station level. So we're going to do one really quick loop. Be delighted to stay for questions as long as you have them. And people online, please shoot in your questions too. And for here in the room, as I heard Scott spell out Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and FERC, if I do use an acronym or really have said something that a normal person wouldn't understand very quickly, raise your hand and catch me on it, and we'll go from there. It's a pleasure to be here, and two of my favorite things in the world to talk about are energy policy and Notre Dame, so it's a great combination. I'm going to have fun with this. But what I want to help you do is put together the energy side of the equation on the university's goal of talking about a just and sustainable transition. Energy is a big part of this. The stakes are very high for all the players, and so there's going to be parts where people are running quickly to move forward and other parts where it's going to be very difficult to make progress. I want to help you be able to understand that. So I'll be working on that foundation, and then the understanding of how energy, environment, and economic justice pieces often fit together, but sometimes they clash. And often, oops, let me put this on. Excuse me. That should help with online. I'll bring up a couple of very specific examples on that. And then I hope we can spark ideas about how your interest in the just and sustainable future can move forward, because there's lots of time. I first came out here after the Enron mess in 2004 and helped the university put together a lecture around the ethical issues of changing energy markets. And it's not unlike what we're going to be getting to today. So I'm going to do it by going over 5 topics. Just getting you some basic facts, who uses how much energy, when and where. The geopolitics, if you're interested in how we cover that today, tomorrow we'll be going into regionally specific issues around the geopolitics. We'll talk about where the trends are now, what the challenges are, and then the ideas for Notre Dame. So basically, what's the situation like today? Where are we headed? It's not where we want to head. So what do we need to change? That's basically what we're trying to do. First point, this is an old graph that I found in my notes. I thought it was very apropos. Energy's always been changing. So this isn't like, oh, everything's been going along smoothly for 100 years and now we need to change it. There's always this change going on. So you can see the first curve ramping down is wood. So it says wood stopped being used in 2000, and I think we'll still find some fireplaces in Aspen and a few other places that are still burning wood. But it's largely out of the picture as a commercial fuel. Coal ramped up. It's actually not down to where it shows here. It's looking like it'll live a little further than 2030, but it's moving that way. Oil went through a similar cycle. Natural gas, and basically you see is always another new fuel in the works. And nuclear, you look at the curve, it did not ramp up like that. So this curve's already out of date. It was out of date back in 1980 as well when it came out. And then you notice the last one is next. And interestingly, it has it for 2030. And we look at solar, photovoltaics, wind. They largely started to get serious about 2015 or so. So it wasn't off by that much, knowing that this came from back around 1980. So, we know that everybody here bleeds green, and the Fighting Irish have lots of diversity. Energy needs diversity too, because we really can't predict the future. We in the Department of Energy's Obama administration years said we still want all the above. Coal is the only fuel I'd say no need for it at this point. But that's in the OECD countries, so the advanced economies can pretty painlessly move from coal. Coal communities cannot move painlessly, so they still need attention. And so Pennsylvania is a very interesting example on West Virginia. They had both the resources for fracking and the coal mine. So still fossil fuel, but they could at least start moving coal miners into much healthier jobs working on frac platforms, et cetera. So some basic facts. Who's producing energy and who's using energy? When the supply and demand come together, you usually create prices. And what are those price signals saying? Boy, the timing, I was chuckling. I've been seeing all these bad headlines about energy the last couple of weeks. Russia's threatening to not supply Europe with enough gas. The price of natural gas in the US is jumping. The oil price has just hit $80 again. It hasn't been there since well before pre-COVID. It got as low as $20 during COVID as all the demand got killed. But so what this shows is who matters in making quick changes. And so China is the #1 energy producer. That surprises most people. Most people figured it was the US or Russia or maybe even the Saudis. But China is #1, not because of oil and gas. #1 oil and gas is the US, #2 is Russia. But they have coal, they have hydro in massive supplies. But what I think quickly emerges here is you got a half dozen, maximum 20 countries that can make any difference in the outcome. Everybody else is a cork on the ocean, bobbing around, basically. So that's the production, supply side, demand side, you can see those bubbles are showing expected growth. You see Asia is totally dominating what happens. China and India and even Indonesia are the big players there. But South America, Africa are also going to see serious growth. The EU, Japan, and the US or North America are declining. Not radical in the US or Japan, but we're not going to see growth there. It's mostly going to be a downward direction. But it tells you where you need to look if you want to stop increased greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a picture of just CO2 concentrations from Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, where they've been following this for a long time. It looks like a zipper because it's seasonal. Is it seasonal because of consumption or because of seasons affecting the levels? I haven't seen an analysis at that point, but there's definitely seasonality to what happens then. Good point to explain is CO2, which is the primary greenhouse gas, but methane is another important one. And it is very important in the question about natural gas. Should it have a role in this transition? I think when we get to reality, it would be a useful bridge. But when we get to the politics, it creates so much anger because it's still a fossil fuel that it's not being constructively used as a way to, we could get rid of coal a lot faster if we could switch to natural gas. And the big question mark there is the greenhouse gas effects, because methane absorbs a lot more solar energy than CO2 does, but it only stays in the air for a small fraction of the time the CO2 does. So this is an area that we can have pretty factual information on, and still the debate continues very hotly. Oh, there we go. Has anybody seen a picture like this before? It's called the Sinkey Diagram. It's actually after an Irish engineer, so I felt I should leave it in. It's showing the flows of energy. It's not the best one. In tomorrow's, we'll look at one from the US that's really informative. You could spend a whole 3-hour class on it. But basically, you see the sources of the supply. You see oil, coal, natural gas, and then down here, just at the bottom of the picture, you see the renewables basically and zero emission fuels. That is not, you don't even see photovoltaic and wind here. They're not big enough to really get their own line yet. So while there's been really promising growth there, it's not an answer in the short term. And looking at, so that's the International Energy Agency. I'll mention this, the two sources of basic information that are credible and objective are the International Energy Agency, which is supported by the OECD, and then the US Energy Information Administration, which is supported by the Department of Energy. That's it as far as globally useful data. You actually can find some stuff on the CIA's fact sheets, their country fact sheets, which I always thought was hysterical. I could actually go look up data the CIA has on each country, but it can be helpful as a double check in those areas. So here Look, this is looking at the emissions. So we see that electric production on the right-hand side is a big source of problems. Transportation, industry, agriculture. So generation and industry tend to have the same solutions, which is mostly switch fuels. You'll see that when you look at that, if you think a couple of steps, if electricity generation is such a big part of the problem, why are we promoting electrification? Because we want to move transportation and industry and buildings towards an all-electric future. The reason is that if we can deal downstream from the power plant in parallel with upstream of the power plant, we can start getting everything on electricity. And then when we can provide zero carbon electricity, either photovoltaic or wind or hydro, we've already got the downstream side of it, the end use part, dealt with. When you look at countries, it's not unlike your energy supply picture. China, US, Russia, and the EU tell so much of the story. And so figuring out a way to make that happen is going to be a real challenge. Okay, the geopolitics. Any questions on that? Those basic facts? Anything seem contradictory or anything? Okay, let me move on. So the energy geopolitics really matter. Okay, skipped a few slides. So this is a really important concept. This is something to make sure you take away. Each of those multicolored lines is, well, what if we had started to make the transition to zero carbon? How much time would we have had if you take as a deadline that you're working with the models that predict climate change? And so in order to deal, if we had started at 2000 as the original set of sentiments were, we would have put less carbon in the air. We would have started from a lower rate of emissions point, and we could have done a gradual slide over to 2100 to get there. But since there's been another 20 years of delay, we've put more carbon and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And now we have to make the change much more quickly. And so that comes from the lack of international cooperation. And I think we had a big milestone when the Nobel Prize was given to the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in 2007. That was kind of the official consensus. Okay, world, we have to get on this train and change where we're headed. So the Paris Agreement was another 10 years almost, but it really brought the world together for one magic moment, basically, and said we've got to hold the expected increases or we're going to run into real disastrous outcomes. And the big nudge there that kind of got the Paris Agreement to happen was President Obama working with China. And then when China and the US agreed to get on board, Prime Minister Modi kind of didn't feel he had any options. It would have been India and North Korea. And he didn't want to be on that side of the dividing line. So everybody was very happy. I saw this pitch. I felt it really captured the elation that happened when that agreement got signed. You'll notice Bill Gates up there. The price of admission was pretty high. He delivered a commitment for $20 billion on what's called mission innovation, which is one of the strategies put in place for accelerating energy technology innovations. And he basically committed a couple of billion himself and brought along 20 of his buddies that are traveling the same numbers of digits in their checking accounts. And it seems like a real win-win if you believe that what he was trying to do was encourage more government R&D spending. And I don't think that's the right path. I think the right path is creating more competitions about specific challenges. But I think we'll be going both ways. So then we decided to move over to the side of the line with North Korea, and the US pulled out and all the operating assumptions changed. The next conference of parties, which is called COP, was COP 25, was supposed to happen in Chile. They moved it to Spain because they were having unrest in their country. It was a disaster, nothing got accomplished. But in 26, which starts next month, so another really fortunate timing for what you're doing right now and what the University Forum's doing over the course of the year is these things are being re-examined, and each nation is looking at its nationally determined commitments. It's basically, the Paris Agreement is a co-op. Each country huddled, said, here's what we can do. It moves in the right direction, and we'll put all of this together. So the goal is to get a recommitment in a month. And it seemed like that was on track, but we'll know better in a few weeks. So the big change, I think, in the COP26 meetings is because of what happened during the Trump years, the US multinational companies learned that they were running into problems with acceptance as a potential business partner. And so all of a sudden, the non-governmental players started stepping up and making more commitments and seeking to create other ways to cooperate with what the Paris Agreement was trying to do. So now we've got nations working, companies working, financial players, and NGOs as well. Notre Dame played a very interesting role in this part of process. In 2018, hosted the Mendoza School working with the Dicastery for Human Development in the Vatican with Cardinal Turkson, had meetings, CEO-only meetings of major financial institutions and major oil producers. It was a surprisingly fruitful meeting, and actually on day 2, the Pope actually stopped by and thanked them for the work they did. And there are statements that basically called for more transparency and commitments to move in certain directions and how that would be assessed. And I encourage you to take a look at that stuff. It's in the Notre Dame news releases, and it was also in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times at the time. And interestingly, as I understand it, Pope Francis and Cardinal Turkson, who is the head of that ministry within the Vatican, are both planning to go to Glasgow for the COP26 meetings. So that's going to be interesting. Okay. So I put this slide here, just make another interesting point. So China is basically saying forget about our dropping coal use in China. That isn't going to happen, but we will up the date for our maximum greenhouse gas emissions, and we'll stop financing new coal plants in other countries. So given their Belt and Road Initiative, that's a pretty big deal. And so that's where they're headed on this right now. So they'll stop that. What that should do is cut down these numbers by a fair amount. So coal production, we remember those big bubbles around Asia on growth. Coal production in Asia is the big part of the story. And this was the outlook from a couple of years ago. So that's kind of where we are at and a little bit of where we want to go. What do the trends look like? Some trends are interesting. So if you look at this picture with the bubble diagrams, you see every organization looked at here. And so some are countries, then you've got the European Union and Sub-Saharan Africa. Everybody lowered the expectations of every country will reduce where they are on the vertical axis. The vertical axis is about the efficiency of national economies. So that's emissions per dollar of GDP in the country. So everybody is getting more efficient. That's a pretty good thing. And interestingly, the advanced nations, US, EU, and Japan, are also lowering their emissions per capita. That tends to be because they've been careless about their emissions per capita. But again, that's helpful. Just a quick look here, you'd see that today the biggest emitters are China, US, EU. When you look at the projections for 2040, it's China's still the worst, the US is third, and India moves up to number 2. So, the good news is on the justice front, India is significantly improving their well-being for their people, but that creates a problem on the carbon emissions front. And Prime Minister Modi's basically been pretty tough on this and saying, we are not going to make sacrifices on that dimension to help you wealthy countries. Which leaves open that if we would pay for some of these changes, they might accept them. But we have to leave the room. Okay. Okay. This is another important slide. I know you can't read the details. You'll want to look at them when you go back and look at the pictures. But the point here is the IEA developed a trajectory that reaches net zero by 2050. It is technologically possible to create that glide path. But I use the term glide path carefully because each of those bubbles is telling you a measure you need to be putting in place in the time frames where they are along that path. And each of them is going to be a major challenge. So it's not going to be easy to get to net zero by 2050. It could be possible. And a key part of this is coming up with a price on carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. And there's no evidence that every nation's ready to do that. The US tried it. The Northeast and California have something in place. The EU's tried it. None of the systems have worked particularly well. There's big inconsistencies between the different markets that are in place. That ties into my old job about people arbitraging things that are really out of whack with each other, like Enron would do. And so this really needs a careful global carbon marketplace to work well. And if it's not working well, it isn't going to work quickly. So that's another area that would benefit from some attention. Sure, Scott.
Don't read all of them. Just to give us an example, some of those boxes, if you read some of the boxes. So I see.
Okay, I need to look.
50% of heavy truck sales are electric.
Yes.
By 2035.
Yeah, so
Reading some of the others.
yeah, net zero emissions in electricity globally by 2040. Again, when you look at the coal that's still in place, that's not going to happen. So heavy trucks, most people, you'll hear about a future hydrogen economy. The reason that people are looking at hydrogen is nobody believes you can come up with a good enough battery to get a serious amount of heavy duty trucks on batteries. You basically have half of the cargo space filled with batteries. Now, on the other hand, Motley Fools had an announcement within the week saying, we found a battery company that we think will be the Amazon of batteries, and we're ready to roll on that. And they've certainly been right with Amazon and Tesla and Netflix. And so it's not a group of insane people suggesting there's a way around this. But their big premise, by the way, is very relevant to what we're talking about, which is they believe that we are now at a tipping point on energy technology, not unlike the tipping point of the internet moving everything towards e-commerce. And so again, if we can get the pricing signals in place and get regulatory regimes consistent among nations, there's a chance of making this happen. It's going to be a rough road. I don't want to say it's needs to be a wartime commitment, but it needs to be close to that, frankly. And you basically need to do things that you weren't planning to do for any rational reason, but you're going to do it for some kind of bigger purpose. And I mean, that's the kind of thing. I actually ran for Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz, his faith-based initiatives group. And he basically said, Bill, this is important to me because faith-based groups can get people to do things that are not easy to do by getting them to make commitments for non-economic reasons. Let's tap into that insight and energy. And interestingly, I was the only senior person at DOE who voluntarily stood up to say, I'll help make that work. And so that's another part of the dilemma here. And it'd be really important to bring that dimension to it. But so here's a picture of where things seem headed. We'd be lucky if we reach net zero by 2090, if we're going along with the level of cooperation we have today. But we really need kind of everything running very smoothly to get there by 2050. And the odds of that are low, but if we can end up between here and there, that's worth the try. Okay, this is another mental image I'd like you to take away. So Scott mentioned the embargoes. This is a photo from the embargoes of the 1970s. That's actually a line to get gasoline. It's not to park at a football game here. And so many, like my younger brothers, got their first chances to drive the car alone when dad said, "Hey, I'll let you drive the car if you go down and get a tank of gas." And they were behind, they got some hours behind the wheel, but mostly they were in the line. Those with good eyesight will notice that the price was $3.49 per gallon. That's about what it is now. That was pretty high back in 1975. Oh, and so, I'm forgetting the main point. When you have a supply and a demand curve, and the government comes in and says, you can't charge more than a certain amount, which is what happened in natural gas and it happened on gasoline. And by the way, that's an important distinction. The reporters and most people talk about gas, they usually mean gasoline. When you're talking about gas for power, that's natural gas. They're different, and that distinction's important. But so what happens when you put a price that binds in place, you reduce the supply because people that need more than that amount on a cost basis to deliver are not going to deliver the rest. And then because the price is lower, the demand goes up. Because, if I don't have to pay $3.50 for my gas, I only have to pay $2.50, I'm going to drive around more. And so price controls are a really bad idea. It was so bad that even politicians learned it back in the 1970s. But those politicians and we analysts are dying off. So next generation needs to pick up this point, keep away from price controls. So the main point here is to get to new price costs of supply, which is critical to speed up voluntary cooperation. You need new technology transformations, but we've had both policy and technology transformations before. The electric markets, the US has kind of slowed down on this, but in most other countries in the world, they've embraced the idea of markets where price signals matter more than building up the rates based on the cost of what's been put in place. Hydraulic fracturing. In between 2008 and 2018, hydraulic fracturing changed the world. It broke up OPEC. I mean, OPEC was totally collapsed. Russia and Saudi Arabia kind of cut some secret deals to be buddies again. And then COVID hit, and then they not only lowered their production, but then the prices went through the floor. But now the US has cut back the fracturing enough that it's led to these price increases in oil and gas as it's renewed OPEC and it's cut the natural gas supplies within the US. I think people can reasonably disagree on their position on it, but there's no way to disagree that that isn't what's created the framework we've been hearing about in the last few weeks. Like the US cannot come like the cavalry to rescue Europe when they're being threatened by Russia right now because there isn't enough gas supply here to ship fleets of LNG over to Europe for this winter. But renewables is one of those that has undergone a very favorable transformation. The smart grid is a really important one. There's issues around the smart grid related to cybersecurity. We aren't going any further than saying that today. The electric vehicles matter, and ending coal, I think that is in sight. We're not going to end it in China, but You probably can end it just about everywhere but China and India in 10 years, 20 at the most. So other justice issues to keep in mind. We mentioned employment in coal areas. That's a big issue, but all of these transformations are going to be shifting where the jobs are. So this kind of gives you a before and after with the patterns that we're looking at today. And you basically see the jobs should be increasing in the electric industry, mostly about putting in renewables, either wind energy or photovoltaics. But that, for every worker, this is going to be a big, serious deal. And we need to create the support systems to help them make the change. This picture is showing the growing need for what are called critical materials. So these are things that are fairly exotic. You know, there's this big change going on as we move from fossil, from the importance of a few regions of the country, the Middle East, Russia, US, for supplying oil and gas, to getting supplies of lithium and cobalt and things like that that we need for the new economy. And so this is growing, and you can see, if you look at the growing height of the columns in each series, it's going to be significant growth. China figured this out way ahead of other countries. They've been purchasing the resources all over the world, and we'll see how that works out. Very recently, the US and Canada were making progress on an effort in the US, but it ran into NIMBY issues, not in my backyard issues, of objecting to any production like this in the US. The people right there have a very fair point. But I think our answer in terms of the geopolitics of this globally has to be a way to do some extraction safely in places other than ones under China's control. Because frankly, if it's under China's control, the safe extraction part disappears, just extraction, right? Okay. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to try to scoot us through to the end then. So there are challenges here and there are opportunities, right? So the opportunities are, let's make progress where we know we can, and let's work around the challenges. That's how I'm trying to get you thinking about this. So we mentioned the critical materials, supply chain issues there, the technology transfer. So right now, there's a lot of theft of intellectual property going on, and that slows down technology transfer too. About the economic justice, you know, we've got this dilemma that the poorest countries, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, they need to grow, the economic growth, and part of the economic growth is going to tend to be some increase in the emissions as well. This calls for wealth transfers, and if you know, some of it gets answered by technology advancement, but the rest just requires some kind of wealth transfers. That's going to be tricky, but coming up with frameworks on that's the kind of thing I hope you can do here. I mentioned cybersecurity. Just basically, the more your solutions involve distributed sensors and controls, every one of those points, you know, this notion of the Internet of Things, each of those points becomes an entry point into the whole grid. And so that opens all sorts of new dangers. Another piece of good news is the technology advances in solar have all the lighter areas, the areas that have weather conditions that allow good solar production. Big picture, there's lots of spots around the world where you could do lots of this. And North Africa and Sahara area are particularly interesting. They could serve Europe. Ironically, Germany's really staked a lot of effort on doing this themselves, but they're a terrible place to be building this stuff. You get a sense of that from this picture. Wind. So I'm sure it's no surprise to many folks here. We're the Saudi Arabia of wind, right? It's the great northern plains. The East Coast is terrific also. The West Coast, almost as good. There are spots around the world also, but only the North Sea seems to be really comparable, and I couldn't find a picture that covered that particular spot. Okay, now I have seen the windmill down north of campus, right, by Steppen Center. That ain't the kind of windmills that are producing economic electricity. But this picture is one blade of one windmill. So just, and basically the production is related to the square of the length of the blade. So the game is get that blade as long as possible. So we didn't talk much about conservation. We did note it in the pictures where we're showing efficiency is increasing everywhere. Conservation is not the malaise type stuff that President Carter was suggesting of turning down the temperature, wearing sweaters. It's about just doing things more efficiently. There are a lot of ways to do that. The best way get that to happen is with price signals. Here is one technology that does that. And just to give you an idea, it pre-cools a building and cools it at night. It's very low cost to use that energy and get the cold into the thermal mass of a building, which basically is a fancy way of saying floors and walls. And it can reduce the use of energy by 20 to 30% on air conditioning. It's basically, you've changed the walls and floors and ceilings from being hotter than what you want, and so they're creating load throughout the day to being colder than where you're trying to get to. And so then you're creating an assist. There's lots of things like that that can be done, but building engineers don't want to do it. Buildings, just in general, and if there are any architects here, please pay attention to this, because buildings have been the low-hanging fruit since the 1970s. When we first looked at ways to improve energy performance, buildings were on the list. I probably could put in the same master's project that I did at Berkeley in the 70s today, and it would still be 90% accurate. Just a context on oil price. So that dark line there is showing the price of oil since we were using oil. You see, it remained remarkably stable up until the embargoes in the 70s. And then it's been quite volatile since then. Volatility isn't a bad thing if you're either a supplier or you're trying to discourage the use. But now we have the supreme irony of the price is high, people are going to seriously be looking at using less oil, and President Biden's out there haranguing OPEC for raising the price of oil. I don't know which side makes sense, but know that you can't have a low price and efficient use and low use at the same time. Another interesting thing, you see that deep blue line on the bottom graph here. That was a day when the price of oil at Cushing, which is the marker price in the US, went below zero. It went to minus $26. So somebody had to pay $26 to get somebody else to take their oil. You know, it only happened, so big news. But what actually happened is people owned future delivery contracts. And then their contract came due at a time when, with COVID, nobody was using oil. Nobody had any spare storage tanks. They had to take the oil. So they basically said, I'll give it to you if you'll just store it. And they got no thanks. So then they had to pay to have somebody take it. A very odd situation. It shows how out of whack the markets were. But this picture shows the expected future was we're getting, at some point in the not too distant future, we might go down as low as 40, but we could go up over 100 again. We're at 80 today. So, okay. The right technology, the change can be rapid. There's two ways to get there. There's government funding of labs. That's not my belief of the way to go. Creating competitions and prizes, but it has to be prizes and competitions for the right things. Like SpaceX, probably the most brilliant example. Another real interesting one is DARPA. DARPA's challenges on autonomous vehicles. I'll skip that one you can take a look. The valleys of death. So, you know, Death Valley, a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there. The valleys of death are kind of the same. If you advance to a stage in your development that you can't afford to invest in the next stage, that's good. It means you really advance your technology. But you got to figure out how to fund that next step. And I just wanted you to understand this. So it's a notion of you start at a bench scale, you go to a pilot plant. That takes, 10 or 100 times more money. When you go from a pilot to a full commercial scale demonstration, that could take another 10 to 100 times the money. These are stages that people come to the government looking for money. The DOE tends to use loan guarantees. Congress likes loan guarantees. They're almost as bad as price controls. But there are ways through this. This is what Bill Gates is trying to fund. He's trying to claim, he's saying, when you get a technology to that second valley of death, I'm going to have $20 billion of patient capital there ready to bridge over to commercial success. You also can drop a lot of money in a big hurry that way. The Solyndra problem was basically something like this. If you look at finance, you'll find that banks, as soon as a company gets a loan that has a federal loan guarantee, it treats it like a T-bill and not like a commercial investment. So then you're not getting any of the review you need to make sure that the technology actually dealt with all of the challenges that are needed to move commercial. It's a terribly distorted way to go at this. I need to finish up. But another way, enhanced oil recovery, you stick this carbon in the ground. The oil companies are trying to sell this concept as if they're doing it for the good of the globe. It's the way they get oil out of the ground nowadays. This is a picture from an old colleague, Amory Lovins, who founded the Rocky Mountain Institute. You got to take a look at this later. It's, again, 13 years between picture one and picture two. They're both Easter parades, New York City. In the first one, there is one automobile, everything else are horse-drawn carriages. The second one, it's all automobiles. You really have to look carefully to find the one horse. But so these things can happen quickly. When you start hearing explanations about the lack of progress that are about the institutional issues, blah, 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 sometimes they're true, like that thermal mass one. I think that there's something seriously deranged with commercial building economics. I don't know what it is, but these also show that when something's really good enough that there's no question about why you want it, it can take off. These are the challenges to identify these to get to just and sustainable transition by 2050. We need more of these. And so here are a few success stories within DOE in the not distant past. LEDs. I chuckled this morning. I was like reviewing this, and I'm under my compact fluorescent light over in the Morris Inn. It's like those things were such a bad dead end, and they still, each one has a little nodule of mercury in it that can poison the water if you don't dispose of it properly. But LEDs are great. Photovoltaics, Moore's law, the laws of electronics basically has worked there. And so the price of the cells has come down quickly and dramatically. We need more of those kinds of things. So I'll finish. We can talk about what kinds of things can Notre Dame be doing. I think the fact that Pope Francis and Cardinal Turkson are going to the COP talks, and they were part of a Notre Dame initiative on climate change, just phenomenal. And we should be trying to provide more support to that dicastery and to everything else going on around it. Father Bill Miscampbell from the Holy Cross community claims that Notre Dame was the first university to be fully electrified. And so darn it, why don't we do this on being the first fully green campus? That's just an obvious challenge to take on. And there's a million other things like that. There's actually a group called Good Land that was started by a woman from Canisius College, and it's about helping the church manage its lands. Turns out the Catholic Church has about 170 million acres of land. That's like the size of Texas. So figuring out how to manage them responsibly, it makes a lot of sense. And we have the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate. So at least for places with buildings on it, et cetera, we should be a natural, just jump on top of that. I think ACE is a model, and we could do something like that. What's going on here? Been fun going over this. If you want to get into the geopolitics more tomorrow, day after tomorrow, we'll start with the new EIA report on an international energy outlook. It just came out, and I'll be drawing some points from that and anything else you'd want to bring up. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Bill. We have about 10 minutes for some questions and interaction. I have a couple myself. There are a couple on the line. Let me first turn it to you. If any of you have questions to pose for Bill Hederman. Ellis, you want to, if you want to say your question, I can repeat it, or you can come up and talk in the mic, either one. You want to come up? Thanks.
All right, hi, Bill. Thanks for a very insightful presentation. So I want to raise a question about something that often comes up in my classroom with students, and that's the idea that transition can be just and sustainable. And you've repeatedly used that term also in the presentation. How do you reconcile that with the excesses that are often the effects beyond carbon, right? So you think about lithium extraction in communities, for example, and I have several examples in my own research where biofuel boom in Africa ended up creating communities without sort of their livelihoods, which was farming, because they moved from growing crops to biofuel-based crops. So how do we have that conversation of thinking about this just transition, but at the same time recognize some of the impacts that wouldn't be looked at?
Yeah, very
Carbon.
appropriate question, Ellis. I do not have the answer, but you're absolutely right. I think the main point I would go to is if you don't deal with the justice and sustainable parts of the solution right up front and make it part of the discussions, it's going to be something that constantly grinds the system and stops the progress. And that's a fair position for the people who are being harmed to take. So you got to create that fairness and trust in the transparency right up front, and that's tough, and it's going to slow things down. But I think it's the point of it's better to do it as fast as possible and try to get it right than to just do it fast and screw it all up.
Okay, I'm going to list a couple questions from online.
Okay.
The first one is, what is your position on small modular reactors? I'll add, what is your 30-second take on small modular reactors? Can you take that one quick?
So I will take the 30 seconds to say a small modular reactor is a form of nuclear energy. I think it's pretty darn risky. There probably is special circumstances where it can make sense. To me, nuclear probably is part of the long-term solution, but I would head towards fusion. I think that there's work that's very promising about fusion now, and I think that's where the nuclear part of the solution lies.
So one question, I'll give you two questions. One is the current oil and gas shortage in the UK facing a crisis in the UK, especially as we head into the holidays, into winter. Someone asked, do you see that as a pattern that will be replicated elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think Russia's part of the modern energy world is they think that if they can cause problems, that's bad, that's better for them and worse for their competitors, and trying to be constructively engaged. And I think that's a big part of what's going on in the UK. I have not been paying attention to the minutiae of the regulatory decisions that have been made there recently, but broadly, their North Sea supply disappeared. Part of the answer was expected to be US LNG landing in Europe and being backfed through, basically the pipes were built to take UK gas from the North Sea to Europe. Now it could take it from the continent when it lands there and over to UK. I think it's a good, canary in the mine shaft sort of moment. Like, we can't just wish things are going to turn out well. We got to make them go that way.
Yeah, another question. Oh, please go ahead.
There may still be a glide path that gets us to net zero by 2050. Given what's happening in politics, the discussion you showed takes no account for CO2 extraction from the atmosphere.
Yeah,
They never do.
that's
So let me just say to those who didn't hear the question, part of it was about CO2 extraction from the atmosphere. What's your take on that? And the other part is, can we really depend on geopolitics to get us there in time with all your projections? That's a question I had as well.
Yeah, so I don't think we can really depend on the geopolitics helping it at the moment. Things are so chaotic. There's a real challenge, but so pick off pieces, make the progress you can, and I don't know how we deal with that. I think that I'm glad you brought up that question. That was what I was alluding to when I talked about prizes. So extracting CO2 from the air and just sequestering it somewhere. So, the natural way to sequester is plant more trees, but the other way is you can inject it into holes that already exist, right? There's lots of reservoirs, they were used for the oil, gas, and other things, helium, were in places like that for millions of years. We can put it back in. You got to pay attention to it. But again, this is technologically doable today, but it's very costly. So a prize that sets up an economical way to do this. This is the kind of thing that people could work on in their garage. Like, what is a way to get the CO2 out of the air? Is it, some kind of filters? Is it some kind of electrical separation? Those are questions that somebody can play around on in their garage. You probably have heard about a Bitcoin mining. It started the same way. Basically, it's some people working their computers and then working them in parallel and solving these Bitcoin problems. But now Bitcoin mining uses as much electricity as Switzerland. I mean, it's a major consumptive thing. Well, maybe there's a way to create that kind of growth in the separation and injection of CO2. I think it's a ripe question.
I want to go back to the first part of the question. I'm not going to ask this very eloquently, but given let's take a cynical view of how far governments and COP and so forth is going to advance and how much progress there's going to be there. The slide I want you to share with us, the one that I couldn't quite read, seems very important. The different benchmarks that have to happen over the next 15, 20 up to 2050 and the particular goals. A lot of those seem to me to be driven by private industry, by corporations, by innovation, not by governments. I realize they're not separate entities and that there's a lot of synergy there and so forth. But I wonder, I guess, if we can have optimism that while the nation states and governments piddle along kind of dysfunctionally, that there is hope for some of these new technologies that you are suggesting are really at the heart of the answer to advance in any case. And, what's the likelihood there? And the related question for me is about China. And again, a naive kind of geopolitical question, but at least in this country, there's competition, there are open markets, it's not a controlled economy in the sense that it is where China just says, listen, our priority is our economy and we'll do what we can with the environment to the extent that that supports that. It's too glib. But, there's a policy being set from on high. So is there any way to overcome those kind of state-controlled policies, no matter what other governments do? It seems like if the technology comes elsewhere, but there's still authoritarian regimes like China that are going to choose economic development over reduction in coal. Are we lost on that point?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I mean, the EU is starting to try to get at that, which would be that they would assess, if you will, almost import fees on the carbon emissions created by the goods you're trying to sell to them, if it wasn't taken account of already. Very difficult to put that in place. But that's what it's going to take. So the example I would go contemplate is something called LEED buildings. So there's this, I don't even remember what it stands for right now, but it's like energy, environment, development. But basically, if you make a building that is more highly efficient, you can get a LEED certification. Like, I think Notre Dame's committed to not build anything that's less than a LEED bronze building, and there's bronze, silver, gold, platinum. I've actually worked with the building in Manhattan that wanted to be the first platinum retrofit building. And so it's very difficult to do on a retrofit basis, but basically people want to rent offices in LEED buildings because basically, if you're not a LEED building, you can't get a Class A certification, which is where the highest rents are. So if you could do the same with cars, which I think will happen with cars, you'll be getting some kind of certification that you're buying a clean car, a green car, or something like that. That can create the demand for a product that might cost more. And the dilemma with China is how do you ever get around the point that the government's in on the bad faith estimates of the emissions and the responsibility and the fair labor practices? I don't know how we get around that. That's something that Nike tried to get around, right? I mean, on clothing, you can make progress, but I don't know if you ever reach the level of transparency you need, but there's ways to make progress.
Okay, I'm going to leave the last question from someone online who asked a very fundamental question that I imagine you can address pretty quickly, and then we'll close. And that the question is, are we shifting too quickly away from fossil fuels when we don't have alternatives in place fully?
Yeah, so fair question. I would not turn off the switch on all the fossil fuels till we really have high confidence in where we're going. The renewables are on phenomenal up ramps now. We still need some way to deal with the days when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. And hopefully by 20 or 30 years, we'll have some fusion solutions there. But until then, you can't beat a gas-fired generator for dealing with that in terms of lowest emissions and clean.
Yeah. Okay, Bill, what Bill Hederman has given us today is a rich overview of a lot of very complex topics, and he's done so in a very clear way, for which we thank you, Bill. And tomorrow we will be back here in this room at 11 a.m. to go deeper into some of these issues. So if you can attend in person, we know everybody's schedule is crazy, do so. If you can just jump in online, great. And then there'll be another conversation with Bill on Wednesday, as I mentioned. So join me in thanking Bill for this inaugural presentation.